One of the most requested videos I get asked all the time is to make some in-depth, some very, very thorough videos on some of the most popular variations in some of the more popular openings. So the Sicilian defense, different variations, the Nasdorf, the Dragon, the Accelerated Dragon, the classical, different things for the Queen's Gambit, some very, very in-depth videos on different variations. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I think it's going to be a great series. I probably have about 80 or so videos in the works for all the different variations. But we're actually going to start with the Sicilian defense, and in this video we're going to start with the Dragon. It is the sharpest, it is the most aggressive opening, and being an aggressive player myself, it is my favorite variation in the Sicilian defense, so I thought what better way to start the series than with the Dragon variation. So we'll go ahead and get into the Dragon variation. It starts with pawn to e4, pawn c5, this is the Sicilian defense, knight f3, simple development, pawn to d6, pawn d4, black's going to exchange his pawns on d4, knight takes on d4, black comes to f6, knight c3, and pawn to gc6. Now if you're watching this and you're like, hey Kevin, you're going through these moves really fast, why are you doing that? Again, this is just the Dragon variation video. If you do kind of want an overview on the Sicilian defense, definitely watch that video first. But this right here is the Dragon variation, so this is kind of going to where we spend a lot of time. Now there are 4 different main lines that are going to come out of this. We do have the Yugoslav attack, which is very, very common, kind of the main line that you'll see. We do have the classical variation. We do have the Levenfish variation. It's my personal favorite. It's kind of the most aggressive. And lastly, we do have the Harrington Gleck variation, but these all come from and stem from this setup right here. This is the Dragon variation in the Sicilian defense. Now, as in most of my videos, I always say one of the more important things you need to do when you watch the video is try to understand the theory behind it, kind of the key concepts that both sides are really aiming for. That way you're not really memorizing moves, and if you get into a chess game and someone doesn't move exactly as you expect them to, doesn't move exactly as they did in the video, you kind of understand the theory and your game plan behind it, so you kind of know how to move forward with that. So before we kind of get into the main line and the main variations within the Dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, I do want to kind of talk about some of the key objectives for both sides and kind of what they're looking for in this game plan. Now keep in mind it is White's move, so White can obviously he can develop another one of his minor pieces. As you can see, he has a huge lead in development, especially in the center of the board here. If he could move another pawn to f4, he could really try to dominate the center of the board. He already is kind of dominating the center of the board. He could develop another minor piece. Black only has one minor piece right here on the f6 square. So as far as development, Black is definitely behind. So White really wants to take advantage of his lead in development. White is also really trying to hone down on these light squares. Obviously, he does have this pawn here on e4. He does have a weakness. He doesn't have both of his center pawns. So while Black does have both his e pawn and his d pawn, White does not. But his pawn here on e4 is very, very powerful, and it does hold down this f5 and this d5 square, both of the light squares on the center of the board, which are very, very important. Now if we look at Black here, Black does have a few options. Obviously he eventually wants to bring his bishop to g7. He really wants to hone down on this long diagonal here. He wants to kind of key in on this dark squares in the center of the board. He already has this pawn here on d6. If he wanted to, he could obviously start to push forward with his pawn to e6 or d5 later on into the game. He does have to be very, very cautious, because if he does move this pawn forward to, let's say, e5, he will have a backward pawn here on d6. So something to keep in the back of your mind when you are playing as Black. Now, from his light square bishop here on c8, he does want to get this involved into the game. He does have his knight here on b8 right now. It typically is going to come to c6, trying to control the center of the board. He does have this c file. It is a semi-open semi-file. More than likely his rook's going to come to this semi-open file. Anytime you have a semi-open file, you really want your rook there because it has a lot more room to go. Obviously right now your rook is worth 5 points, but if it can't go anywhere, then what really good does it do for your game? So those are some of the key concepts that you're going to be looking at into the game. Obviously White's trying to dominate in the center of the board, trying to control development, trying to control the white squares, the light squares on the center of the board. Black's really trying to develop his pieces from the outside, kind of a hyper-modern defense, and then later on he's going to try to use this C file and try to get some counterplay on the queen side. So we're going to go ahead and get into it with the main line, and that is the Yugoslav attack. Now the Yugoslav attack, again, this is the main line. It continues with bishop to e3, again, simple development move from white. Typically his dark square bishop is his least valuable bishop in the game. Black's going to now play bishop to g7. Again, black really wanted to fianchetto his bishop, try to control this long diagonal. And then white's going to play pawn to f3. Now right away from this pawn here on f3, we know a couple things. One, he's trying to support this pawn here on e4. Again, this pawn on e4 is a very, very strong pawn, controlling the center of the board. But we also know that this pretty much means that white is going to castle on the queen side. Typically, if you do move your f-pawn and you castle on the king side, it typically is going to be coming to the f4 square, meaning you're trying to eventually, if it exchanges off, you're going to open up this file for your rook after you castle on the king side. In this case, that's not what the goal of this pawn on f3 is. It's trying to support this pawn here on e4. It's getting ready for later pushes on the king side of black. So white's really not looking to castle on the king side. If he were, he's pretty much just making his pawn structure a lot weaker, and he's really not giving his rook a lot of room to play around. So in this case, f3 pretty much says that white's going to castle on the queen side. Now, as you can already imagine, black's next move is going to castle on the king side, and there's going to be a lot of fireworks. Anytime both sides are going to castle on different sides, it's pretty much just going to be a tactical crazy nightmare, and there's going to be just a lot of aggressive play, and if anyone slips up, it's pretty much going to be game over. So keep that in the back of your head. If you're not real comfortable with crazy and wild tactical games, this might not be too good for you. The good thing I like about the dragon variation from black is across the board in the three main lines that you'll see, pretty much it's the same moves over and over for black. It doesn't really matter which variation white chooses, -1, which we'll get into later, but all the main ones that you'll pretty much see day to day, black's going to pretty much move the same thing. So if you're sitting here and you're like, hey, there's all these variations in the dragon, I don't really remember all those, that's okay, because you're going to be moving the same thing. You're going to be fianchettoing your bishop to g7, you're going to be castling on the king side, you're going to be bringing your knight to c6, you're going to be bringing your bishop to d7. It's pretty much all going to be the same from here. Also keep in mind this pawn here on f3 is really blocking this knight coming to g4. Instead of with this bishop fianchettoing on the g7 square, black, if he could, would actually like to come to g4 with his knight right away. Again, keep in mind that he does want to bring his bishop to this dark square and control the long diagonal. White later on to the game really wants to exchange off these dark squares. So if black in this situation can exchange off his knight here on g4 for the bishop on e3, this is actually going to be a good trade for black. He can hold on to his strong bishop in this game. But if you can see in this example, if he plays knight to g4 before he fianchettos, that's going to be a huge mistake. White can now come and play bishop to b5. Doesn't really matter how black plays, he's going to lose a piece. If he plays bishop to d7, it doesn't matter, he can lose a piece just with queen takes on g4. Or if he takes, if he moves his knight to d7, same thing, doesn't really matter, he can move his queen takes on g4. So he is definitely going to lose material in this situation. We'll go ahead and continue with the main line, so we'll go ahead and back up here. And instead of bringing the knight to g4 right away, trying to attack this bishop here on e3, black's going to continue and fianchetto with his bishop to g7. White's now going to play f3, so we're no longer even thinking about bringing our knight to g4, and we'll continue along. Black's going to castle on the king side. From here, white's going to play queen to d2, again getting ready for his king to castle on the queen side, and black is going to play knight to c6. Now there are two different variations from here that white can play. Before I get into those, I do kind of want to stop again and kind of look at some of the themes for both sides on the chessboard right here. Now if we kind of look at white, white's really going to look to exchange off the dark square bishops. Again, the dark square bishop is typically the weaker of the bishops for white, typically because the light square bishop can attack the f7 square, which is a huge weakness for black early on into the game, especially since it kind of holds down and pins down to the king here on g8. So if black has his way, he really wants to exchange off the light square bishop from white. So later on, once the light square bishop comes into the game, if it comes to c4, if it comes back to b3, doesn't really matter. Black is really going to try to exchange off, whether it be with a knight, whether it be with a light square bishop. He's going to try to exchange off this light square bishop because that's going to be a huge pain in his side as it takes on this f7 square right here. Now also keep in mind, later on, once this bishop from c8 gets involved into the game, now the rook is going to get involved. He's going to come to the c8 square and he's going to really try to put a lot of pressure on this semi-open file for the c file. Also keep in mind that white's really not going to be moving his pawn here on a2, b2, or c2. Obviously once he castles on the queen side, if he's going to be moving his pawns, it's going to be on the king side. He's going to be thrusting forward with moves like h4. He's going to start getting his bishop involved into the game. He can start bringing his other pawns involved into the game. He's not going to be wasting moves with a2, b2, c2 thrusting forward. So if you do see your opponent making moves like that, make them pay, because again, both sides are going to be castling on different sides, so it's pretty much going to be whoever can mate their opponent fastest. So just keep these in mind when you're thinking about this. Now again, I did talk about two different variations. One of the variations is to castle on the queen side right away, and the other is to bring the bishop to c4, attacking this f7 square right away. Now both of these are going to take place in the Yugoslav attack. It just really depends on which one you want to do first. Now keep in mind, if white decides to castle on the queen side, black can always push forward with d5. Again, with any opening, anytime you're doing a hyper-modern defense, basically trying to control the center of the board with your minor pieces from the outside, eventually you want to crack open and control the center of the board. You don't want your opponent to control the center of the board the entire game. So once white castles on the queen side, then black can play pawn to d5, again trying to disrupt the center of the board here. Now a lot of times, instead of castling on the queen side first, you may instead see the bishop come to c4. Again, this is now stopping the pawn coming to d5 immediately, and it's also putting a lot of pressure on this f7 square. Now from here, you may see black develop his bishop to d7, and then from here you may see white castle on the queen side. So again, as we talked about before, both of these moves are going to happen. It just is a matter of when you want these moves to happen. Now from here you could see black bring his rook to c8. Again, really trying to put a lot of pressure on this c file. Now one thing he does have to keep in mind is this knight here on c6 will have to move. Typically you'll see the variation continue with the bishop coming back to b3. Again, he kind of wants to make it safe. If this knight were to come to a5, he could put a lot of pressure on it. But this bishop here on b3 is still putting a lot of pressure on this f7 square, so it doesn't really matter if he has it on this c4 or this b3 square. Typically does a little bit better on the b3 square. It doesn't kind of clog up the middle of the board here. From here the knight can come to e5, again trying to control the center of the board more, but at the same token, he's also allowing for the rook to really hone down on this c file. So these are some of the key themes that you'll see within the Yugoslav attack. Again, it's going to be very, very aggressive on both sides. From white here, white can really try to start to attack on the king side. He can start with moves like h4. Black can try to stop that with pawn to h5. If white wanted to, he could bring his bishop into the action and try to trade off these dark squares as we talked about before. And then black's going to try to counter on the queen side. Again, he does have this semi-open c file. He can start to push these pawns forward. He can play, let's say, a6. He can start them with b5. He also has, his central knight here with e5. This can kind of jump into the action whenever he wants to. He does have this light square bishop that can kind of support these other pawns and pieces. So it's pretty much going to be chaos. Pretty much white's going to try to control the king side, and black's going to try to dominate on the queen side. So this is the Yugoslav attack. Definitely one of the main lines, definitely one of the more exciting lines if you ever have played it. It's pretty much just chaos and sharp lines all over the place. So definitely recommend trying this out. If you really enjoy chess, I think this will really pique your interest. Now the next line is the classical variation. It's for those white players who come across the dragon variation very often, but they really don't want to get into the sharp tactical lines the Yugoslav attack gets into. Instead, they kind of like the positional play. They like the really solid openings, and they really like to play, ABC chess. And so for those players, we have the classical variation, and from the dragon defense, we have bishop to e2. Now, as you can see, this is very different from the last defense. The bishop before was coming to c4. After white had castled on the queen side, really tried to put a lot of pressure on black on the king side. Now once he plays bishop to e2, he's no longer looking to play pawn to f3, which means white can really think about castling on the king side. Now he doesn't have to, but that option does, playing bishop to e2 does give him this option. So I've seen many people play the classical variation, and from here they will actually castle on the king side. Now, as you can imagine, if both sides castle on the king side, there's not going to be as many fireworks. So if you're playing as white and you come across the dragon variation, you kind of want to slow things down a little bit, and kind of put the speed bumps out there, then go ahead and just play bishop to e2. Don't go ahead and play bishop to e3. Get into the Yugoslav, instead just play bishop to e2. Don't worry about pawn to f3. Just kind of do the quiet play. Now from here again, as I told you before, black's moves are kind of the same. So black's going to play bishop to g7, fianchetto his bishop, trying to do the same thing. Now the bishop from white's going to come to e3. Black's now going to play knight to c6. Again, he's really trying to control the center of the board. All the moves are again very similar. White can now castle on the king side, and black can now castle on the king side as well. So again, as you can see here, this is more of a positional play. There's not going to be as sharp of lines here going on. White does have a few options. He can always bring his knight back to b3, really opening up this d file if his queen wants to get involved into the game. He can always develop his queen, and then he can start to get his rooks involved into the game if he wants to really eye down on this d file. He could also bring, if he wanted to, he could bring his knight over to b5. Again, typically more times than not, you're going to see the knight come back to b3. It's actually a very good square for the knight to come back to. Now, from black's point of view, he's kind of trying to do the same thing. He's trying to control the dark squares on the center of the board. He's looking to get his light square bishop involved into the game. He does have a few more options now. He could always now bring his bishop to e6. He's not too worried about the bishop coming to c4, as that would kind of be two moves for the light square bishop from white in the opening. You typically don't see someone moving their minor pieces over and over again if they don't have to. Also, the rook can come to c8. He can try to control the semi-open file on the c file. So a lot of different things going on in this variation, the classical variation, but it all kind of stems from the same ideas that we talked about in the Yugoslav attack. But this is the classical variation. Now the next variation we're going to be talking about is my favorite variation. It's the Levenfish variation. It's actually more aggressive from white. So if you're playing white and you start out with e4 and black tries to counter that with the dragon variation, basically saying, hey, I'm ready to go, let's do this thing, you can respond with the Levenfish variation, which basically says, hey, I want to be even more aggressive than you are right now. And that actually is pawn to f4. You can kind of tell right away that fireworks are going to ensue. And what this pretty much does is it kind of starts the fireworks as far as the pawn thrusting forward right away. Typically in the Yugoslav attack, even in the classical variation, doesn't really matter which side you're going to be castling on. typically there's going to be a lot of pawns being pushed forward. Typically in the Yugoslav attack, once the queen's castled on the king's castled on the queen's side, all the pieces are developed, then white starts to really push forward with the pawns. The 11 fish variation pretty much just says, hey, we're going to push forward right away with pawn to f4, really eyeing down with this pawn to e5, really trying to control the center of the board here. Now this is the one variation that I talked about where black has to change things up. As we'll talk about here in a minute, if he plays bishop to g7, this is actually going to be a big mistake from black, which is why I like to play this from white's point of view. So yes, we are going over all the variations from the dragon, but I do also want to give a shout out to the players that are playing white. You may come across this many times, so even if you don't want to play this as black, if you are white and you do see this, you may want to throw the 11 fish variation if you are very aggressive. Because a lot of times, again, as we talked about before, people that play the dragon are so used to playing the same moves over and over. They're so used to fianchettoing their bishop, then bringing their knight to c6, then castling on the king's side. They pretty much don't know anything different. But in this case, they actually do want to bring their knight to c6 before they fianchetto their bishop to g7. And I'll show you why here in a minute, but pretty much they want to stop this thrusting forward of pawn to e5. If we exchange right here, then the knight can take on e5. But if this knight's not here, it's going to be a lot of problems going forward. So that's kind of what I want to talk about right now. If the bishop comes to g7, black's going to have huge problems. From here, white can play bishop to b5. Very, very strong move. Black does have a lot of different options. I kind of want to go over the main ones. It's really not going to do a lot of good to bring his knight to c6. Again, he will lose material. It doesn't really matter how we kind of slice that up here. He is going to lose material. We could even, if we wanted to exchange with our knight here first, and then he's going to check the king here and attack this rook here on a8. So that's not really a good move. His other options would be to bring a piece to this d7 square. So we'll kind of look at some of those options right here. His first two options he does is to bring either the bishop or the knight here to d7. So we'll go ahead and start with the knight here coming to d7. Now from here, again, as we talked about before, white's going to push forward. He's going to play pawn to e5 and starts to put a lot of pressure on this knight here on f6. Now it doesn't really matter if black exchanges or not. It's pretty much going to do the same thing. We'll go ahead and take a look at it. If he does exchange, we'll say that the pawn takes on e5, white's going to respond taking, and now the black knight has to move. Obviously he can't take with his knight here from d7 because he's being pinned down from this bishop here on b5, so he has to move. He can either come back to g8 or he can move over to h5. Doesn't really matter, we'll just put him here on h5, and then the pawn's going to continue down the board, putting a lot of pressure on black with pawn to e6. Now, the really only way that black has to save face here as far as a material standpoint is to play pawn takes on e6. After he does that, white can now come in with knight capturing on e6. You can start to see black's really starting to fall apart as far as his structure. His king's no longer safe. Doesn't really matter if he castles on the king side or the queen side. He's not going to be safe at all. You never want to fianchetto your bishop on the king side and then lose your f pawn. This is definitely not the way you want it to go. Obviously the king here on e1, he can castle on the king side, make his rook here on the f file very, very powerful. It's a full open file. Or he can always castle on the queen side. He does have a lot of safety here on the queen side. So it doesn't really matter how you look at it, black's going to be in a lot of trouble. Now again, we can come back here. We can, let's say he doesn't move his pawn here, he can always move his knight back to g8 right away. Doesn't really matter. White's going to continue with the same thing as we talked about. He can bring his pawn to e6 now, again putting a lot of pressure on this pawn on f7. Again, he's also attacking this knight here on d7, which cannot move. So again, the only thing he can do is bring his his pawn to e6. And after he recaptures, again, we're kind of in this same boat right here, putting a lot of pressure on black, and there's not a lot for him to do. Same thing is really going to happen if he brings his bishop to d7. We're going to continue doing the same thing, pushing forward with our pawns. Pawn to e5. Again, if he captures, it doesn't really matter. He's going to take. Knight's going to have to move, and then we continue to push forward with the pawn here on e6. If he takes, he's still going to be in a lot of trouble. Do want to touch on one other point. Probably one of his better moves he does has is if he brings his knight back to d7. From here, white has a few options, but again, if you kind of look at it, white's really putting a lot of pressure on black, and black's really stopping a lot of his development possibilities. Yes, he is kind of saving face a little bit as far as a material standpoint, but he no longer can get his light square bishop involved into the game. He can castle on the king side, but he's pretty much moved his minor piece, his knight here on f6. He's now moved it to d7, which is not, you really don't want to be moving your minor pieces all over the board. Also, as we can tell, white does have a lot of different options from here. He can castle on the king side, really start to put a lot of pressure. Again, he still has his pawn on f4, so he can start to push that forward, put a lot of pressure. He can always get his queen involved into the game. He can get his dark square bishop involved into the game. It's going to be very hard for black to put a lot of pressure on white right now. In other variations, we have a lot of tactical, and aggressive lines from black, but right now is just kind of being passive, kind of just blocking everything that white has, and white's kind of just starting to really dominate the center of the board as far as development. And it's going to be really hard for black in this situation. So again, the 11 fish variation just starts with that pawn to f4. Very, very aggressive line from white, but I find it very, very useful, especially for those players that are not too familiar with it. Now the last variation is the Harrington-Gleck variation, and there's not as much theory on it, so I'm not going to go too in-depth in it just because you don't see it that often at all. But definitely knowing the concepts that we've talked about in the video, you may want to try it out. It does have some great positional play from white's side. Again, black's theory is kind of the same. He's going to be playing the same moves from the beginning. But it starts out with bishop to e3 from white. Black's going to continue the same thing with fianchettoing his bishop to g7. The bishop is now going to come to e2. Black's going to castle on the king side, and then the queen's going to come to d2. From here, black's going to continue with knight to c6. Again, same format we talked about before. And then white has two options. He can castle on the king side, or he can castle on the queen side. So if you're looking for a lot of, a lot of different ideas as far as which way you can go, you can kind of mix it up. You can try some games castle on the king side. You can have some games castle on the queen side. More times than not, you're going to see castling on the queen side. Again, you kind of do have all your pieces kind of lined up against the king side, so you kind of have an attack already starting. And again, from here, white really wants to start pushing forward with his pawns on the king side. He does start to have his bishops and his knights ready to go attacking on the king side. So not as sharp as play as we've seen from some of the other moves. The Yugoslav attack where the bishop's coming out to c4, putting a lot of pressure on black on the f7 square. But you definitely still see a lot of solid play from white. So it really depends on how aggressive or not aggressive you want to be in this defense from both sides, from black or from white. You have a ton of different options. There's so much theory, so many fantastic games that you can watch. If you kind of like one of the variations, if you say, I really like the 11 fish variation, go check out some different games of some of the famous players that have played that. If you kind of like the Yugoslav, go check out some of the famous games played by that. There's so much great theory based on all these, and kind of think about some of the themes and the ideas that we've talked about, and kind of see how those players use the semi-open file for their rook here. See how white really tries to control the center of the board with the light squares. See how white really tries to exchange his dark square bishop off the board, and how black really tries to exchange the light square bishop off from e2. So really don't just try to memorize all the moves that we talked about. As we get into the series of going into the different lines, really just start to pay attention to all the theory and the key concepts that we're talking about in the video. So again, this is video number 1. Hope you guys enjoyed the video of some deeper analysis of some of the variations that you'll see in some of the more common openings like the Sicilian defense. If you have requests, definitely let me know. Again, I have a huge list of videos that I do want to make. But again, upon request, I definitely will move those up and down depending on how people are requesting those. So hopefully you guys enjoy the dragon variation in the Sicilian defense. Definitely leave some feedback. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.